Well, good morning, everybody. Happy Halloween from the Great White Pumpkins, Mike and Norm. I mean, boo. And I do psychoanalysis, 4 mornings a week. And so I ended the session by saying, well, I guess I'll go put my costume on and pretend to be a lawyer today. Talk to you tomorrow. And it occurred to me this morning, Better Call Saul is, in my view, one of the more interesting lawyer shows on television. Usually they're stylized. The lawyers, they have hairdressers, makeup artists, $5,000 suits. They don't seem to work too hard, and they succeed in ways that don't seem real in the day-to-day practice of law. The practice of law is far more gritty, realistic, and steeped in tragedy and mire and gore than anyone can imagine. Now, the writers of Better Call Saul get it more or less right in some respects. The greatest scene in television history with respect to lawyers is Saul Goodman returning to his nail salon office in the back of a nail salon one day, and he sits in front of his court and his telephone, and he does the Kreskin routine. Every practicing lawyer knows what that is. That is his praying to the gods that there be a decent referral in the phone. Oh, let there be a paying client. I get all these calls. Hi, I'd like to be one of your pro bono clients. I got so sick of hearing that one day. I said, well, you know what? I'd like you to be one of those rare things that somebody pays the full fee. Do you think we could work that out? Got the dial tone. But anyhow, Saul Goodman works for that. But then Better Call Saul fell into the same sinkhole that the series 24 did with Kiefer Sutherland. Back in the days when terrorism was on everybody's mind, it was an interesting premise. There's an existential threat to the United States. Intelligence agents can do it. Let's create a dramatic series. Well, it got crazy. Because every week they had to outdo one another. And at some point, it just got exhausting. Let the Republic fail. I need a good night's sleep. It was implausible. Better Call Saul fell down that sinkhole. He should have been disbarred 67 times by the end of that season 3. There's real drama in the practice of law. So here's my idea for a new lawyer drama. And that is Better Call Norm. And it's a lawyer's meeting with his psychoanalyst every morning to discuss his cases, so that psychoanalysis and lawyer interaction becomes the focus of the series. And then the expectation of what would happen or what should happen from the psychoanalytic perspective in the morning is contrasted to what plays out during the day. It might not be for everyone.
I think that's actually pretty compelling. That's a compelling plot, Norm.
Yeah, it occurred to me in the 10 minutes between leaving my session and coming on this morning, because we invariably giggle our way through the session. How do I know I'll never be mentally healthy? My analytic laughs when I think the psychoanalyst laughs when I'm trying to be serious and doesn't when I'm trying to be funny. But there's a lot there, because the practice of law is a soul stretching, and it can be a soul destroying experience. And the realistic dramas that lawyers are intended to address are often lose-lose situations in which the best that can be accomplished is the maintenance of a sense of dignity in the face of the overwhelming despair that you're confronted with in people's lives. And humor is a way of dealing with that. So we'll talk more about that later. We'll explore. Perry Mason Norm. No, Perry Norman. No, but we'll talk more about that later. We've got plenty to talk about today, as we do most days. And let's see how many of these topics we can cover. Interesting developments in Texas. Tell us about the TRO that Texas got against the United States government, and what's the lawsuit about? And then let's talk about whether this is an opportunity for the United States Supreme Court to reconsider a 2012 decision involving Arizona.
So the Western District of Texas, the Del Rio Division, there was a lawsuit filed there by the state of Texas against the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Mayorkas, who is atop the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Border Patrol, and the whole federal gamut there with respect to the southern border of the United States.
Well, what's Texas trying to do?
And Texas seeks to enjoin permanently the U.S. Department of Homeland Security et al. From interfering in its efforts to stem the tide of migration into Texas via the southern border. So this is something that we've talked about pretty regularly here over the last several weeks, Norm. As you recall, we had Adam Ellwanger from The American Mind come on and discuss the realities of generational migration in Texas. We had Mark Meckler come on and discuss Convention of the States and the concept of federalism within the context of immigration and mass migration. And it appears that on October 24th, the state of Texas filed this lawsuit. They motioned for what's known as a temporary restraining order, and as well as a preliminary injunction. So just procedurally, we know that the temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction combination from prior episodes and streams are those equitable remedies that a petitioner here in the state of Texas can seek from a court. And a court has the power to enjoin or to order a party to take certain conduct, to engage in certain conduct, or to cease and desist from certain conduct.
So Texas got a federal judge to tell the United States government it could not do what?
It could not destroy or otherwise interfere with the property that the state of Texas is using, aka this concertina wire and other items that they're using to stem the tide or to otherwise disincentivize illegal immigration across the southern border, which they have been doing. So if you've been on X, if you've been on any of the social media platforms or paying attention in the news, you've seen all sorts of stuff regarding, you've seen federal agents or those who apparently are federal agents in uniform, removing wire, cutting wire, moving stuff out of the Rio Grande, et cetera, Norm.
It's interesting. So, this calls into question a holding from the United States Supreme Court in 2012 involving Arizona, which attempted to take immigration control or control of its borders into its own hands in 2011 and 12 and lost. And the United States Supreme Court held, and this is an important discussion for our viewers to focus on, because it highlights the concept of federalism. The Supreme Court held in the notion of preemption, the so-called preemption doctrine. And what am I talking about? You'll recall from any number of our streams that when we talk about the distribution of public power in the United States, of authority of the government to make binding decisions that bind the rest of us, we have two sovereigns basically every time we're on United States territory: a federal sovereign and a state sovereign, two governments, as it were. And the relationship between those two governments is sometimes tense, and the boundaries between one government and another can be uncertain. The concept of federalism basically says that when the federal government acts, it is the supreme law of the land. That's in the supremacy clause of the Constitution. And so a state might have police power, that is the residual power to legislate in the name of the health, safety, education, welfare, and morals of its population. But if the federal government has occupied a field of endeavor, if the federal government has claimed the power to act in that sphere as its own, then the states are preempted or prevented from acting. So 10 years ago, Arizona, faced with the immigration issues of its own, sought to enact laws that gave Arizona officials the ability to arrest people, to question their ability or their right to be in the United States if they didn't have papers, the requisite immigration papers, and to require employers to take certain steps to assure that their employees were citizens. The United States Supreme Court struck those laws down. Arizona was sued by the United States, and in United States versus Arizona, a 2012 decision, basically the court wrote a comprehensive decision about the preemption doctrine, and it said that the right to control the United States borders belongs to the United States, and there are important corollaries that follow from that. How we treat immigrants, even unlawful immigrants from another nation, could have consequences on how that nation treats our residents in their lands. And therefore, this goes to the ability of the United States to conduct its foreign affairs. That was a 5-4 decision at the time. And obviously, the composition of the court has changed, and I think the nation's political sensibilities have changed. So I think if you're sitting in Texas and you're at the point. You've got a long, what is it? I don't remember how long the Texas border is. Something tells me it's more than 1,000 miles with Mexico. And you've got people streaming over that border, and you've got the United States government refusing to do anything effective to control the stream of those immigrants. It's not the United States that's absorbing the brunt of this migration wave. It's the people of Texas.
That's right.
And so don't the people of Texas, as part of their police power, have the right to do something about it? And so I think that, you know, this litigation, the United States versus Texas, will invite the Supreme Court to reconsider Arizona versus United States. And candidly, I think the balance should be struck in favor of the states, especially a border state. Because, you know, the United States, I mean, people in Indiana and Ohio don't have quite as much skin in the game as the people in Texas, especially the people in southern Texas, who may feel there is an invasion going on. And you see plenty of people using the invasion metaphor to discuss immigration. The things that, you know, and it's been a stroke of genius of Governor Abbott and other border state governors to transship migrants to large blue state cities like New York, saying, what are you going to do about it? And now suddenly Mayor Adams is saying, hey, no mas, no more. He's traveled south of the border to try to discourage people from coming into the United States unlawfully. So I think the political calculus has changed, and the manner in which this case will be litigated will be similar to United States versus Arizona. But I expect the issue to come to the United States Supreme Court, and I expect we'll likely get a 5-4 or 6-3 decision carving out an exception to the preemption doctrine. Yes, immigration control may be a matter of federal law. Yes, the creation of federal immigration statutes is reposed in the federal government in part by the United States Constitution, but no part of that made the states a passive partner in assuring the health, education, and welfare of their citizens. And so there is a tension between the requirements of federalism, the limits of the preemption doctrine, and the application of the police power on the states on the ground in a state where people are being overwhelmed and swamped and their quality of life being sacrificed to distant federal interests. So keep an eye on this suit. I think it's a fascinating one.
Well, and I don't want to overstate how broad this lawsuit is from Texas against DHS at all. So just to make it clear for the listener, because Norm, I think that what you're saying ultimately is true, and I agree with that sort of forecasting. But what we're talking about here really is the what we would call, I guess, a state law chattel property claim, right? The state
explain to people what chattel property is.
So this is just personal property of a given party, right? And so the narrow issue that is being dealt with by the court in this case is necessarily the federal government's use of forklifts to raise concertina wire so that migrants could go underneath it and pass through the border. Right.
You know, if you're a Texas resident, you've done that to protect your property, and the feds come in. How do you not feel it's time to leave the union? You know, I mean, you're trying to protect your property, and the feds are saying, no, we're going to lift that fence so people can come scurrying under it. How do you not feel the federal government is a foreign power at that point?
Well, and I love the court. So, and again, that means that this temporary restraining order only affects the government's treatment of those concertina wires, right? Because that is what is property is defined as in this order. However, the irreparable harm prong of that TRO, because there are 4 elements of getting a TRO: likelihood of success on the merits, irreparable harm, I think public interest, and one more. But here, just to be quick about it, the court literally says the plaintiff preliminarily establishes that it would face irreparable harm without a temporary restraining order. The plaintiff alleges that, quote, by damaging, destroying, and exercising dominion over state property, the defendants are causing the plaintiff to incur extensive costs. The plaintiff also claims that the defendant's actions show they intend to prevent the plaintiff from maintaining operational control of its own property. That's the second one. And then the plaintiff avers that destroying the concertina wire, quote, irreparably harms Texas because it facilitates increased illegal entry into the state. Right. So we are getting at that. Like, so what really is the story here is sort of that directional control of the border. Right. On one hand, we see that Texas is trying to secure the border. And I think we could all acknowledge that the federal government and the individual border states share that overlapping obligation and responsibility to secure the border. Right. However, it seems to me, and probably to you too, Norm, that directionally it appears as though the federal government is not only abdicating its duty while it does have a plan in place, but it is actually facilitating and subverting the efforts of the border state Texas here. Right. So while this suit is really narrow and sort of a civil sort of state property, like a state chattel property claim against the federal government by Texas, it seems inevitable that we will be deliberating and litigating over the issue of irreparable harm vis-a-vis that third prong of a state being prevented from its obligations and duties to the citizens of its state.
And that's going to take place within the context of a discussion of preemption. I say Arizona versus United States is vulnerable. And if the Supreme Court upholds the United States government's position in this case, it'll just increase pressure to dissolve the union. Because if you're a Texan, you don't want somebody in Washington, D.C. saying you can't control your own border.
Shout out to In the Cloud for the $10 tip. Trick or treat. Thank you, In the Cloud.
Yeah. So let's shift. I want to tune you guys into a new publication, or at least a publication you may not know, and we want to discuss an essay in it. It's called The New Criterion, and I believe it's a quarterly, and it's a magazine of ideas. And the article I'd like you to take a look at today is by a woman named Margot Cleveland, and it's about populism, the promise of populism. You know, populism gets a bad ride. Many conservatives say, it's the dark side, it's the angry side of public opinion, and the political ideas ought not to be rooted in a person's sense of inchoate rage at their situation. Populism is dangerous. Populism is out of control. Margot says, no, it's not. Let me read you some quotes from her. Conservatives are faced with a stark choice. They may remain apathetic and go quietly into the night, or they can welcome into the fold the people who stand ready to rebuild America on her foundational principles. Conservatives should champion populism and define it for what it is, and embrace the lowercase d democracy that underlies our constitutional republic. Conservative populism, she writes, is not a contradiction in terms, but the last hope for a nation increasingly lacks a unity of principles and leaders of conviction, and faces the passionate intensity of the enemies of all we hold dear. Populism's appeal crosses the divide by reaching public where they are. And right now, people are angry. That's what people are in Texas. That's why you've got the issues we just discussed. People are angry in Ohio. People are angry in New York City. They're angry at the destruction of all that is good, true, and noble about America. Angry they should be. Angry we should be. Conservatives should feel the anger of the masses, with anarchy having been loosed on our shores and the innocence of youth sacrificed to the perverted ideology of the zeitgeist. I mean, this is an article that at least spoke to me, because my sense of the world right now is that we have become undone in the United States. If you take a look at our commitment to diversity, it used to be that we regarded that the appeal of diversity was the appeal of pluralism, that there were many roads to the truth, but that there wasn't belief that there was an underlying truth or a sense of reality or a sense of what the good life entailed, that reasonable people could disagree about the means to achieving, but that they would ultimately all agree about the end. And that was a cultural commitment to what I will call the broader visions of Western civilization. Those ideas are under attack now. And populism has gone so far as to yield a situation now where we value diversity for the sake of diversity. And the result is that every life form is of equal value, regardless of how crazy, perverse, or insane it may look. And we're all expected to give equal respect to every expression of the human spirit, even if that expression of the human spirit is outright insane, perverse, twisted, or sick. And people should be fed up about it. And so I commend Margot Cleveland's article to you. Let me read another paragraph from her, a short one. No longer then are populists a rudderless people searching for a different shore. They are now a populace aware of America's decline and determined to rebuild the country for themselves and their children. And, clearly that's a commitment that Mike and I have made here with Law and Legitimacy, is to try to build a discussion where common norms can once again surface from the cacophony of broad public debate. We can call out what is ridiculous for being ridiculous. We can ridicule the craziness of our times, and in a safe space where we won't be shunned or canceled for having dared laugh at some of the sacred cows of our times. The established order, she writes, it is now disorder, and it must be rebuilt on foundation laid more than 200 years ago. I'll go Margot a little better. It must be rebuilt on a foundation that was laid millennia ago, and that is the foundation of Western civilization, the Judeo-Christian tradition, and Western norms. So again, folks, take a look at Margot Cleveland's essay in the New Criteria. There are other essays we'll talk about in the days to come.
And this is the October 2023 issue. You know, Norm, just to bookend it here, I thought it was thought provoking, and what I've got on the screen here is ultimately the call of the question, as we say in I guess legal academia for purposes of this article. By which star shall we guide our country? And her fundamental question for Republicans or conservatives, whichever you prefer to go by, if you self-identify within one or both of those groups, the article spends a great deal of time summarizing really concisely but in vivid detail the excesses of the elite and governing regime over the past 5 to 6 years. And I don't need to go into subdividing all of that, but suffice it to say that everything is included in there. And the question is ultimately, if we're going to be populists, do we necessarily need to worry about the label of conservative and or Republican? Or are we going to let that burn down and reemerge as something else? And if we are going to reemerge as something else, as a party, as a collective, as a group, representing those interests that you just talked about, Norm, right? That our rights come from God, that they pre-exist the government, are protected from the government only by adherence to the Constitution, then what are our first principles as populists, right? So really good read. Thank you for commending that, Norm.
Well, let's look at it in more in weeks and months to come. And you know, I encourage folks to take subscriptions to magazines of this sort. There are small operations that require cash to survive, and that means they require readers. And I suggest to you that reading that sort of material is important. You know, as if to prove the point about how perverse our times are. The Exorcist was released nearly 50 years ago, and it's been re-released with director's cuts in it. What was cut from the film, we now learn, was a lot of the traditional Catholic theology. It was felt to undermine rather the entertainment value of the film. And, you know, when I first saw it, it was being re-released and remade. I suspected it had been remade in order to accommodate our new woke times. You know, the story is the story of a young woman, Reagan, the daughter of a single mom who becomes possessed by the devil. And Father Karras, a priest of unclean hands, and some of uncertain faith, meaning his faith is in doubt in his own mind, is called upon to exorcise the child, and he's not sure that he has the strength to do so. And so the scene has shocking content. I remember going to see it in 1973 when it first came out. I was a freshman in college, and I couldn't believe the things they were saying. You know, there's little Reagan with choice words about Jesus, and at one point she's possessed by the devil, and she turns to the Father and says, "Father, guys, your mother sucks cocks in hell." I mean, this was like, and Karras is shaken because he had a difficult relationship with his mother. He felt that he hadn't loved her enough, and he had images of her suffering in hell. Well, I thought, wait a minute. And now, is that like unsensitive to the woke? Do we need to redo The Exorcist? I mean, sucking cock is now a norm, right? And moms need to do it too. And if they do it in hell, well, girls just want to have fun, right? So what, you know, maybe we need to eliminate the line about mothers sucking cock in hell.
This is funny. You're not, are you aware that there is a new Exorcist movie that came out earlier this month?
No.
Yeah. So,
well, okay. So
that's your homework. October 6th, That's your homework, but
Oh,
go on, because I'm interested to see
okay.
how correct you get it, because I haven't seen it yet.
All right, but so maybe it is my homework, and I'll watch it. But so maybe it's now offensive to say that mothers suck cock in hell. But we need the devil to be provocative. So in the new woke version of The Exorcist, here's what Karis hears from the little girl: "Your father is a cis white male who has sex in the missionary position." Oh no, not that! Can he be so straight? How terrifying! Well, so I see in the New York Times over the weekend that we've got a reprise of the film, and they've got 3 of their critics who are going to comment on the film, and it's though to illustrate the triumph of sociology over spirituality. We learn from Eric Piepenberg that really The Exorcist is a queer movie. In The Exorcist, her demon is an allegorical homosexuality. When Father Karras and his other father try to cure Reagan with the words, "The power of Christ compels you," they say out loud, that it's not okay to be gay. As I see it, Reagan wasn't an innocent girl overcome by an old demon. She was a young woman with new rage who gave voice to queer people who are tired of being told that they were sick and needed to be cured. I mean, seriously? The struggle between good and evil is now made and transformed into gender politics. But he wasn't alone, Mr. Piepenberg. Manhola Dargis writes that The Exorcist is essentially a women's picture. The focus on Regan's body in The Exorcist similarly ties it to a female-driven melodrama in which ostensibly troubled women are diagnosed and cured invariably by a male doctor or lover. Therefore, it's fitting that the biggest, most contested film to open in 1973 is about a life or death struggle over the female body, a fight that the United States Supreme Court's biggest, most contested decision of the year, Roe v. Wade, symbolized. What am I talking about when I talk about the triumph of sociology over spirituality? I'm talking about the elimination of the person and their idiosyncratic sense of responsibility for self, and their transformation into a historic or social marker, where a person doesn't become the sum of their choices. They become a sum of what's happened to them. And making better people doesn't require people to make better moral decisions. It requires restructuring society so that we can create conditions in which people are better. It's the triumph, frankly, of what people call cultural Marxism. Marx used to say that ideas
of grievance studies,
cultural Marxism, same thing. Because the Marxist idea in the German ideology, and in the written, I believe, in 1844 by Marx, he tried to turn Hegel on his head. Hegel viewed history as a force, as a collection of spiritual, ideological conflicts in which we overcame limitations imposed upon ourselves to become absolutely free in the course of the outworking of the dialectic. And it's, I can go on. But Marx tried to say history was materialistic, that what we are is a function of the material factors of our lives, and that our ideas are mere smoke screens for that. Hence, the United States is a set of class conflicts now revolving largely around race, and everything is, you are defined by where you are situated in the struggle for racial justice. You don't have any sense of personal responsibility. You don't have any relationship with God that transcends your historical circumstance. When everything becomes sociology, everything becomes grievance, and the state becomes the arbiter of good and evil, and it has the ability to dispense the good life by altering social institutions. The Exorcist I have thought of as a spiritual drama. I thought of it as an insight into the window within us and the fact that everyone is capable of evil and is capable of succumbing to evil. That movie terrified me because I know myself to be a sinner. In 1973, I had a job as a security guard at night in college. It was a work-study job, and I used to have to walk around buildings in the middle of the night, and there was a little metal key. I'd have to prove I was in the building by turning the metal key in the lock. Well, to be honest with you, we snuck out one night on the job and went to see The Exorcist, and my friends dropped me off in this big, dark building, and I had to go turn the key to prove that I was there. I sprinted down the hall. I was terrified that something was going to pop out and get me, and it was that something that was going to pop out from within myself, my capacity to do evil, perhaps to be possessed. I gave up the job rather than work any longer in those dark halls. But the point is, The Exorcist was a spiritual drama. It was a drama about good versus evil. And in the third essay in the Times that's discussed, the author of The Exorcist, the book, William Peter Blatty, was a devout Catholic. And a lot of his theology was edited out of the film in order to make it more entertaining. I believe the re-release, Mike, that you're referring to is the one with the director's cuts. Some of the theology was cut.
It's a different iteration. So we're talking. You and I are talking about two different things. So there was a new movie, The Exorcist, and I forget there's like another word that modifies it. I can't remember what it is right now, but that came out earlier this month, and I guess the protagonists are two, and it's two young girls.
Well, it would have to be, because after all, we can't have males having control of the keys to insight into good and evil, because we are in this, the best of all possible worlds, and evil incarnate, especially we white males. The devil has a new face. You're looking at mine, and you're looking at Mike's.
Don says, postmodernism infected all of the humanities, not just sociology. How has it affected the law? So to that, I responded in the exact same way, but it got me thinking, Norm, what was your undergraduate degree or degrees?
So I primarily politics with a heavy concentration in biochemistry.
So you're rare in that you had a minor, effectively, or a second major.
So I started out as a biochemistry major and completed most of the requirements for that, but frankly, not all of them. And I left it because I found that I was resenting how much time I had to spend in labs. I wanted to spend my time in the college cafeteria arguing about what made for a good life. And so political philosophy struck me as a better way to do that. And that's what I went on to study in graduate school.
So here's
a university I will not name.
Yeah, well, we don't want to get into sign stealing, do we? Anyway, so
go blue, go blue. We'll talk more about the legacy of hate directed at Jim Harbaugh later.
Here's why I ask. It seems to me that Don's question begs some scrutiny based on sort of the pipeline of graduate to postgraduate in modern academia and higher education. And I have a hypothesis here. I'm willing to bet that the overwhelming majority of new law school 1Ls come from a humanities degree in undergrad. And I don't have any statistics at my disposal to validate that. But what I'm thinking is that if this perspective that you've talked about, and that I think you and I agree on, and Don, yes, that postmodern sort of grievance studies culture, that sort of modern Marxist take, materialist take on modern America, if it's infected, as you qualify, the humanities across higher education, then I'm assuming that that law's predisposition or to succumb to the same thing is based largely on the fact that most of its 1Ls and its graduates and freshly minted attorneys have graduated with that sort of, I guess, doctrinal background in grievance studies, right?
Well, maybe. I think it's more fundamental than that. The law is really just a set of doctrines, a set of conventions that are used to resolve discrete disputes. And so the case study method is how lawyers are taught law. People have a dispute over something. They go to court, and general rules are used to decide it. There's an argument about which rules should apply and whether they correctly are applied. The case goes up on an appeal. It's a reported decision. You spend 3 years in law school reading thousands of reported decisions to acquire an intuitive grasp of the overall architecture of the law. But the law is written in general terms, and often words like justice, equity, right are infused in the interstices of the law. In other words, they're the corners on which the law turned. But there's really no broader critical discussion of that. That's left to jurisprudence and moral philosophy, which aren't required courses in law school. And so we are living on the fumes of a natural law tradition. We are living on the fumes of a Judeo-Christian tradition that gave those terms concrete and real meaning. But now they're tokens that people are permitted to deposit their preferences in. And the result is when a critical race theorist hears justice, they hear giving preference to Black people for goods and services. When a queer study person hears justice, they hear giving recognition to a person who can't decide what gender they are because their indecision is itself valuable. And so the result is that Dawn is asking a good question. The postmodern critique of all that exists, and the notion that every expression of a universal truth or a universal is in fact a particular the expression of a person's particular situation in a social structure, universalized beyond their application as a struggle for power. And therefore, the task of the social sciences of law and of society is to dismantle structures of power so that everything is equal. That's the postmodern. Ethos, and the result in the law, Dawn, has been a collapsing of all norms, and the view of law is simply a struggle for power tokens.
Yeah, and all I'm saying, Norm, is that most law students are not looking at the world that way, but they have been primed through their undergraduate degree program and largely high school at this point too, right? Because that sort of postmodern sort of grievance studies culture is going down just as fast as it's going up in terms of educational curriculum. So it's not as if there is some sort of outbound intentional, affectation from most students with respect to I guess what you say, pushing out a natural law tradition. It's that they are not, that students by and large are not competent or capable of observing and identifying that in practice, in law, when they get to law school, because they lack those moral foundations, then they lack that plurality of history that would give them some context as to what certain words arranged in certain patterns and, putting certain things in the spotlight than others, right? It is a language game, but what I'm saying is that most students are not reading thousands of cases as you talk about in law school these days, right? And most students aren't really doing that much work in undergrad either. I'm very cynical about the education system, but I'm telling you that it is more of a pattern of avoiding scrutiny that could otherwise, make you persona non grata. And that in and of itself is all the programming that is necessary for these things that now exist in academia to take precedent into the corporate world, into the justice system, into local communities, because most people aren't even competent of recognizing what a contrasting example would be that they actually agree with, right? They've just been primed. These are young people. Remember that. 16, 17, 18, graduate high school. 19, 20, 21, 22, you're done with undergrad, presumably, right? Now you got a whole lot more debt. Then law school, you start at 22, 23, and you graduate 25, 26, and you have no real world experience. You never had a mortgage, right? You don't have any of these notions of what rights are being given up, or being subverted by this sort of collective consciousness, this grievance studies culture. So I think that what you're saying and what I'm saying are probably like, I don't want to be tail wagging the dog. You're right. But in general, the way it's propagated at scale is through sort of the unknowing, sort of banal masses, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And and it's our challenge here to come up with a solution, and that is, to put to people the fundamental question of, what have you done for righteousness today? How have you squared with your sense of significance in the universe? Have you sought on bended knee a meaning greater than yourself? Have you asked for guidance? Have you sought grace? Does the concept of God, does the notion of a personal God suggest to you something risible or something that you want to know more about, more than you want to know anything else? And where you fall on what the divide in those questions determines whether you're a modernist, whether you're a postmodernist, lost in a cave and cavern defined by your own desires, or whether you're prepared to meet the challenge of modernity by holding the torch of Western civilization up to the darkness of our times and say, I believe, help thou my disbelief.
See you tomorrow, Norm.
Ciao. I got to run because I got to go to court. I got to play lawyer for Halloween. Happy Halloween, everyone. Trick or treat.
See you.